Hi, I'm Mary.
And I'm Katie, and this is The Housewife Did It.
True Crime Edition. West Memphis 3, Part 3. If you like our show, even though our audio blows, you can share it with others. And then we could possibly monetize this and get new audio equipment.
And do it forever.
Please, yeah. But yeah, liking, subscribing, sharing, reviewing, all of that helps other people find our show more easily. It makes it more recognizable and basically validates it on the podcast platform. So please do that if you haven't already. Yeah.
Yeah, do we need, probably not, but same content warnings as before. Yeah. I will say, I assume in the trial we may get into some details. Yes. I don't know. So, content warning.
Yes, details, but ones we have already talked about.
Okay.
Other than just there's I guess maybe slightly more details as experts are called to testify, but yeah, same content warning. Are you ready? All right. So part 3 is the trials. The trial of Jessie Misskelley Jr. and the trial of Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin, who were tried together. And then we have one more part.
I thought you were going to say, and our fly.
And fly.
And welcome the expert of flies.
I mean, he's got to be.
Right?
Here's my question for the fly community.
I don't know why you were here, if that's you.
The flies like this that you're that's a big ass fly, but it's not a horse fly. Are these queen flies?
Possibly.
Queen bees and queen ants are so much bigger than the regular ones. Is it a queen fly? But flies are independent, I think.
Yeah, they're not
I don't know.
And then now we're going to try to minimize distractions.
Okay.
Mary can't stop looking at her fly, though.
It's freaking me out. I don't want it to touch me. All right. After their arrests, Damien, Jason, and Jessie were prepared for trial. The county bought them suits so they would not have to undergo trial in their prison jumpsuits, much to the chagrin of the parents of the murdered boys. Damien and Jason,
just standard.
Yeah.
It is considered unfair to have people look like already criminals.
The part in Paradise Lost where Mike's mom, she says they want them to look like little choir boys. It reminds me of the kid from
and the sorry people.
And we're the sorry people.
Yeah.
Not to laugh at her being upset, but every time she says it, I expect her to say, and they want them to look like the sorry people.
They want them to look like the queens, and we're the sorry people.
They're the greatest thing on earth. Okay. Damien and Jason would be tried together, but first Jessie would be tried on his own. Much like their questioning during the investigation, the trial would focus heavily on the idea that the 3 teens killed Stevie, Mike, and Chris as a part of a satanic ritual. Jessie's trial was held in Corning, Arkansas, and the lawyers and judge requested harsher security measures going in. They discussed the possibility of including metal detectors and having Jessie already in the courtroom before anyone else could enter, especially in light of him receiving death threats. However, his attorneys worried that this amped-up security would also send the message that Jessie was a violent and dangerous individual.
Yeah.
Which, I think that, honestly, it sounds like these security measures were more to protect him.
They were, yeah.
They just didn't want anyone to think like, oh, he has to already be in the courtroom because he's like scary.
Yeah, and I do think like from what we know about the community of West Memphis, and not just their intelligence levels, but also just the way they feel about this already, like I think that like they might think that. Like they might not think like, oh, we're attacking him. They need security for him. They're thinking like security equals like he's bad, you know?
Over the course of his trial, Jessie turned 18 alone and in prison. He admitted that he cried himself to sleep most nights.
Buddy.
Yeah, it was like sad. He got birthday cards for his 18th birthday. But he also talked about like that he like really missed his family and like his girlfriend.
Yeah.
Jessie Miss Kelly Jr. pleaded not guilty to the murders. His defense team explained to Jessie early on that they would need to establish his level of functionality in order to prove that he could have been easily coerced by police.
Mm-hmm.
They focused heavily on what they believed was a false confession based on police coercion, explaining to the courtroom that this was a false story. They brought in an expert witness on false confessions, Richard Jason Offshay, a professor emeritus of sociology at UC Berkeley, a real college. Offshay's expertise lied in police coercion of small groups and confessions and interrogations. Offshay testified that Jessie's interrogation was a classic example of police coercion. He and many others believe that Jessie's confessions were inconsistent with the crime scene and were constantly changing. This is not a belief. This is a fact.
True. Yeah.
It's just simply what it was. As we mentioned in the first two parts, Jessie got confused about things like how the boys were tied and with what. At one point, he claimed that Damien had raped one of the boys, but their autopsies clearly showed no signs of penetrative sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
We also talked about, and we were like confused about this, that the autopsies showed dilation of all three boys' anuses, but forensic experts at the trial clarified that this is very normal postmortem.
Okay.
That your body naturally does that. They're like, this is not any indication of trauma to the area.
So otherwise, like the only indicator would be the believed genital mutilation of Chris Byers.
Yes. Okay. That's why I said like penetrative.
Sure, right.
Because like if he was castrated, that is sexual mutilation of some sort. When the defense asked Gary Gitchell how he could be so confident in Jessie's guilt when he got so much information wrong, Gitchell said that Jessie told a good bit of the truth.
Yeah, I feel like they like are like, well, he's so stupid that like we can't expect him to get the story completely right. And then everyone else is saying right, but he is so stupid that like he can't, like this is like not allowed. But I feel like in Gary Gitchell's mind, he's like, well, even though he was there, like how can you expect someone with an IQ of a 6 to 9-year-old to get it right?
Right. but except unless it's Aaron
Hutchinson. Yeah.
He said Jessie told a good bit of the truth, and then he must have either gotten confused or he was attempting to distance himself from the crime. Because in a court of law, when you find someone guilty, it's based on a good bit of the truth.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they say.
That's what they told the jury too.
Offshay argued that Jessie said whatever he could to get out of the police station and believed that if he confessed, knowing he didn't actually do it, that the police would eventually figure that out and everything would be straightened out later. This, like, word for word is what they said in the Central Park 5 case. That those boys said, I thought that they would be able to prove that I didn't do it.
Yeah.
And that like, I would be fine.
Yeah, and in the case of Jessie, like, he technically, through his whole confession, like, stands by, like, he did not commit any murders. Yeah. And so kind of like you said last time, like, first of all, like, this is, like, just belief in justice system, in police. belief in the fact that, like, if you're innocent, you don't get convicted of crimes, and, like, could be his intelligence level that he is, like, he doesn't even know that, like, you could get convicted of murder even if you didn't commit the murder. So, like, he might think, like, well, I'm keeping myself in the clear, and, like, yeah, I'm throwing these guys under the bus, but they won't get them either because they didn't do it.
Right.
And he's just like, yeah, wrong on all counts, buddy.
The defense also showed evidence that all of Jessie's confessions came directly from police's questions and not from any original thoughts of Jessie's. Ofshay said that what he found most compelling as evidence of Jessie's false story was the fact that police asked him about the time of the murder 8 times because Jessie's account of when they were in Robin Hood Hills was not matching up.
Mm-hmm.
Jessie never mentioned the possibility of being there past noon until police said that night, and then he repeated that portion of the question. And that's when they were like, oh, now he's got the time right. But, like, he didn't. He just repeated them.
It's like, could you imagine any other, I don't know, metric in the justice system being that, like, but they got it right 1 out of 8 times?
Right.
So it's true. Like, whoa.
And the one time they got it right was a repetition.
Right.
Of someone telling them what to say.
Yeah, but it's also like, there's only 12 numbers to choose from. Like, 1 and 8, even if they weren't repeating, like, he might get pretty close to the time you want if he just keeps throwing things out.
And, like, every time they asked him, it was like, it was getting later, but it was, like, still before noon.
He was like, he was like, sure. Like, he was like, it was not dark. And then he's like, it was dark. It was getting dark.
Yeah. And so then in this last time, they said, like, that night when y'all were there, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, yeah, that night, blah, blah, blah. And, like, it wasn't a question at that point anymore. Mm-hmm. Like, they told him you were there that night.
Yeah, and then they kept saying things like, well, just a minute ago you told us. And so it's like, what the fuck are y'all talking about off camera or off whatever?
The police who originally interviewed Jessie testified that they were assigned to meet with him because he was friends with Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin.
Nice.
Jessie's attorney...
But not really.
Yeah.
He's like, am I?
He's like, okay. Jessie's attorney met with his friends, family, and neighbors at Jessie's home to go over expectations for media interviews, and several of them told him that they saw Jessie sitting outside his home at the time he originally told police the murders were happening. And at the actual time of the murders, Jessie claimed he was out of town at a wrestling match.
Oh, great.
Which seems like something you could prove, but...
Mm-hmm. If you wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Jessie's defense also focused on the idea that 5'1", 17-year-old Jessie could not have physically committed these crimes. Mm-hmm. Based on various aspects of the crime scene, it seemed unlikely that teenagers could have been responsible for something that seemed so thought out and practiced. Like, they speculated that this was not the first time this person had done this. Mm. They claimed that the crime scene looked intentionally cleaned. Police had believed that the boys had been cleaned because they had been in the water, but the defense team argued that there should have been some sign of blood somewhere.
Where they were hurt and bleeding.
Right.
They weren't beaten in the water.
Right.
I presume.
Right. And so then they, in Damien and Jason's trial, they go on that. They're like, okay, y'all are saying that they were killed in this spot, had to be in the water because there's no blood anywhere. But also they say that they believe that it had to have been indoors because the boys had no mosquito bites, which I think is like such a fair thing to notice in the South. But if they had no mosquito bites, is the implication that they haven't been outside in days and weeks?
Plus, what I've heard is that they did have significant mosquito bites, but that it was because they left them on the bank for 2 hours. So unless it's just we're going off police eyewitness that they said when we pulled them out of the water, they didn't have mosquito bites. And then by the time they made it to their autopsies, they did. So they like assumed. But it's like, I don't trust those fucking police eyewitnesses. Like, I don't know shit. Like, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. The prosecution attempted to reiterate what Jesse had said in his confession about attending cult gatherings in the woods, where he witnessed and participated in animal sacrifices. They claimed that when they showed Jesse the autopsy photo of the boys, he fixed in on them and just stared at them. They were like, "Can you believe that?" I was like, he looked at the pictures you showed him?
Really hard?
Up until the point Jesse saw the photos, he had denied any involvement in the murders. When questioned about the reason Jesse was shown these photos, Officer Ridge admitted that they had hoped it would evoke a response and keep him talking. He said they did not at the time consider how it would affect someone with a disability, but did hope it would scare him into a response or a confession. He said this on the stand. During this time, as the autopsy photos were being shown, Pam Hobbs had to leave the courtroom. She spoke to reporters outside and told them that she had not seen these photos yet and had hoped to avoid hearing or seeing exactly what had happened to Stevie. I know.
That might not have been the place to be, though, Pam.
Right. Terry Hobbs had absolutely no reaction during this interview. He said no words.
I already knew that.
Stared blankly at the camera. His wife was crying and he was like, the prosecution attempted to discredit Afshay by implying that he only agreed to testify because it would earn him more money than simply consulting with the legal team. They then asked him to analyze specific questions, and he reminded them that there were several hours of unrecorded interview with Jesse that he could not possibly speak on. Like, this is what they were trying to get him to talk about. He was like, that's not in the recording. How am I going to analyze it?
Yeah.
In their closing remarks, the prosecution made a snide comment about how suspicious it was that Jesse had refused to look up for the entirety of the trial, which is true. In
That's
judges'
suspicious?
quarters, but listen, in judges' quarters, Jesse told his family that keeping his head down was what his lawyers had told him to do. And his family agreed that if he hadn't, they would have said he looked around too much. And I think this is such an example of Jesse's level of functionality that he heard keep your head down, and he thought he literally had to keep his eyes glued on the table the entire time he was in court. Like, he did in the whole documentary, he does not look up even one time, and he is like fixated on the table. And like, I just feel like maybe that's like a part of it, is like they're like, keep your head down. He's like, I have to stay. My head has to be down.
And it is true, like, they would have had a problem if he was like, if they can like make judgments off your facial expressions, they will. So on
February 5th, 1994, Jesse Misskelley Jr. was convicted by a jury on 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life plus 40 years in prison. The first-degree murder, I believe, was for Michael Moore, because he had said he had run away and Jesse had chased after him and brought him back. After the conviction, the prosecution met with the parents of the victims to let them know that Jesse had not acted like an innocent man in any way, but instead had bragged about the murders all the way to prison.
Yeah, once again, not recorded.
Sure.
That really sucks.
Also, why were you with him all the way to prison? As the defense team for the prosecution. Or sorry, the prosecution team.
Yeah. I don't know that he wanted you there.
Why are you with him?
They're like, no, we're friends with like the people that transport him. They told us.
Yeah.
Probably true. That is probably who told them, but
yeah,
they were lying too.
Right. The parents of Michael, Stevie, and Chris were thrilled that Jesse was found guilty. In their interviews after the conviction, Melissa Byers said, quote, "Prison's not a safe place. Jesse, sweetie, I'm going to mail him a skirt." End quote.
Melissa.
Look, I am not going to pretend that I would not be as angry as she is if my
Yeah.
child was murdered. But what a thing to say.
See, like, it's one of those things that you, like, yeah, you think it, right? But
Yeah.
and I think that's fair
What do we call that?
we call that an inside thought. But I think it is fair to be like, people don't understand that, like, this happens when you do this to children, when you go to
Right.
prison. But that's like one of those things you say to your husband at home, and you say, like,
Right.
I know this sounds shitty, but you know what I want to say? Blah, 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 blah. And you
Right.
don't say it when a camera's in your face.
Right.
Especially when there's no evidence against this person, but
Yeah.
whatever.
I find it interesting that, like, in the investigation, I feel like Damien was, like, the most hated.
Right.
And after the trials, it felt like Jessie was. Like, I don't feel like anyone had that strong reaction to Damien after the trials. Like, they weren't, like, saying those things about him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jason and Damien went to trial just 3 weeks later. Due to the Breton Rule from 1968's Breton versus United States, Jessie's confessions would not be admissible in court for Damien and Jason's trial unless Jessie chose to testify against them in person. If he did this, he would also receive a reduced sentence, but he chose not to because he didn't want to lie about Damien or Jason in court, he said.
Honestly, though, and this is just like a theory, but, like, I honestly feel like it would have made it worse. Like, like, I think they maybe could have gotten off because, like, you put Jessie up there and, like, have him attempt to, like, give the same story that he gave in that confession, it will not happen. Like, he can't do that because he didn't do it. So it's like, I almost, obviously I get why he didn't, but I'm like, man, I kind of want to know what would have happened because I feel like it would have been so clearly false.
Right. The prosecution was slightly worried about losing out on Jessie's testimony, but they said they did have some solid evidence. One fiber from Jason's home and one fiber from Damien's home, as well as some witnesses that heard confessions from both boys.
Great.
As they went through the trial, the 3 teens and everybody else were being filmed as the subjects of an HBO documentary called Paradise Lost, the child murders at Robin Hood Hills. Jason did not testify in trial, but did give interviews for this documentary behind the scenes of the trial. He admitted he was confused about why Jessie would have confessed to the murders and implicated Jason and Damien. He explained that people thought he was a Satan worshiper because of how he dressed and what music he listened to, but then in reality, he was a Christian. He said, just like everyone else around here.
Yeah.
He also said that he
Just
never
me,
really...
a normal, God-loving guy.
He said, they say I worship the devil. I worship God like everyone else in this town. He also said that he never really went to Robin Hood Hills in general because there was a lake right behind his house where he could go fishing and then just feed the fish straight to his cat.
Yeah, what purpose?
He said, why do I need to go there? I have all the fish I need right here. Damien said in some of these behind the scene interviews that he felt the police were incompetent and eager to prove that they could solve the case, so they picked on a group of boys that stood out in the community. He talked about how people around town had been spreading a rumor that Damien had Chris Byers' testicles in a jar under his bed with Damien's fingerprints all over the jar, and Damien suspected that police may have had a hand in starting that rumor.
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
Both boys and their parents agreed that they were home for the entirety of the night of the murders, but police did not take it as a solid alibi.
They said, we don't need to check those phone records. Silly.
The prosecution brought in an informant to testify against Jason. Michael Carson, who claimed to have met Jason in prison, testified about a time when Jason confessed to him. He claimed that they had been playing spades one day in August, and he asked Jason if he had committed the murders, and Jason said no. Then later, Michael said he caught Jason alone and told him that if he confessed, it would stay between the two of them. Clearly, it did. And at this, Jason admitted to killing the boys, sucking the blood from their penises and scrotum, and then dismembering them because they were dismembered.
And bloodless.
Right. Interesting. Michael did not come forward with these allegations until February after a conversation with his counselor. The counselor spoke out against Michael Carson, saying he was LSD dependent and had made up the entire account. He said that he was the one who had originally told Michael Carson about the murders and Jason's possible involvement, and Carson had actually never met Jason himself. He told his counselor, that he had presented allegations against Jason, and the counselor was mortified that he had taken information from their counseling sessions and then lied about it to convict someone. The prosecution called Dale W. Griffiths, someone who they called an expert in the occult, to testify on behalf of their theory that the murders were part of a satanic sacrificial ritual. Griffiths was a graduate of Columbia Pacific University, an unaccredited distance learning school in California that was closed by court order 6 years after this trial. Interestingly, this trial was not the first time an occult expert had been called to look into Damien Echols. In 1992, Officer Jerry Driver of the West Memphis PD reached out to a cult expert with Damien's medical records to see if they indicated that he was involved in the occult on behalf of the Arkansas Department of Youth Services, a year before these murders even happened.
HIPAA.
Damien had been in a treatment facility, and this is the time when you can say that's a HIPAA violation. Not all of those other times. People say it. Damien had been in a treatment facility in Little Rock 11 months before the murders due to a history of self-mutilation and hallucinations, including the idea that he had the spirit of a woman who had killed her husband inside of him, and that he would one day greatly influence the world, which I don't think is a hallucination. To say that one day you will greatly influence the world. That's a dream.
Yeah. But like I just wonder, like, was he having hallucinations?
So also in Paradise Lost, he does say that he did not feel he had any mental illnesses. He did not understand why he was there, and that he felt like when the police put him there, basically, that he felt like it was because they didn't have anything to arrest him for. And it was their only way of getting him away.
Yeah.
So
I mean, does that just mean like half the medical records are fudged? Like,
right. And I
think that just not true?
Yeah, I think that and we talked about this with the persecutory hallucinations, delusions that some of these things aren't delusional, and
right. Yeah, and even I'm gonna greatly influence the world could be considered a delusion of grandiosity,
right?
But it's also I just really think I'm gonna make a difference in the world.
I have a kid in my class. Any given day, you say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" He'll say, "Famous." I say, every time I say famous for what, he says, "I don't care.
I don't care.
Just want to be famous.
Whatever.
I'll do whatever it takes." But, and I think that the reason they point out the greatly influence the world is because they're like, "Oh, and he did greatly influence the world."
Yeah.
But I do think that it's possible that the self-mutilation was real,
and it's they've said he was very depressed.
Right. He in his book
It could all be real. Like, people who are mentally ill, like, are often, like, not able to see it, but it just feels like with Damien Echols, like, we would have seen it again and again. Like, he obviously wasn't getting, like, mental health treatment in prison.
Right.
He was, like, so he had no more hallucinations the rest of his life. Like, it just, like, seems weird, but...
Yeah, and I think, in his book, he talked about that there was a boy that he had gone to school with that had, hung himself or tried to hang himself.
Sure.
And that he, like, that it, like, really, like, messed with his head, and he, like, thought about it a lot, and he was like, oh, like, he must have felt the same way that I feel being in this miserable town. Yeah. And, like, he's just a sad kid. Like,
yeah,
he was poor. He had nothing. He had, like, he didn't have anything to do ever. Like,
he did not have, like, family he could count on.
Right. It was tragic. Griffiths testified that some of the telltale signs of a cult member include black clothing, check for Katie. Black hair, check for Katie. Black fingernails,
sometimes check for Katie.
Sometimes. And tattoos, check for Katie. And I also want to point out, though, that Pam and Joe Hutchison and all of Damien's siblings also have black hair. So it's not like he's dyeing his hair black.
It's just his hair.
That's just what he looks like.
Yeah.
Anyway, this so-called expert also said that it should not be ignored that the date of the murders, May 5th, was close to an occult holiday.
Close.
May 1st.
They just missed by a little bit.
Couldn't get it done then. Is May Day. Also called Beltane in the pagan and Wiccan religions, and it is a day to celebrate the start of the summer.
Wild.
Dastardly.
That is repugnant.
Yep. They discuss also it's like celebrated all over Europe.
Yeah.
Like, I went to a bridal shower that was May Day themed.
Yeah.
Like, come on. They also discussed how Damien read books by Anton LaVey and Stephen King.
Oh.
Lock me up.
How dare he?
They asked Griffiths to speak on Damien's Wiccan Book of Shadows, where he pointed out that the cover of the book had a pentagram and upside-down crosses, which he said were important symbols in both Wiccan and Satanist religious practices. He opened the book to show that Damien had underlined sentences and passages about the devil and blood with a red pen. The prosecution argued that Damien knew too much about the genital mutilation of Chris Byers.
He underlined it with a blood pen.
They claimed that at the time of Damien's interviews, there had not been any public knowledge of Chris's mutilation or Stevie and Michael having been drowned. Damien said, "That's not true. I heard it on the TV."
Dude.
Mara Leverett, an investigative journalist and the author of Devil's Knot, suggested the possibility that Damien heard these rumors from Mark Byers' circulation of the information that police had told him in confidence. He was telling everyone. The prosecution also used Damien's past behavior against him, questioning him about violent incidents, despite the fact that Damien had only been in 1 or 2 physical fights in his entire life. His team attempted to object to this line of questioning, but was overruled, and this conversation became a part of the trial.
Yeah, this judge should be done away with.
Horrible. Next, the prosecution asked Damien about his knowledge of Aleister Crowley, an English occultist, philosopher, ceremonial magician, poet, painter, novelist, mountaineer, and founder of the religion of Thelema. Damien said he knew of Crowley, but hadn't read any of his work. The prosecutor asked Damien, "Didn't Aleister Crowley believe in human sacrifice?" And Damien responded, "Well, he also believed he was a god, so..."
I don't know him.
At Damien's dismissal of the question, the prosecution brought out a set of documents that Damien had written in prison with a set of names written in different alphabets. It read Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, Damien Seth, Azaria Eccles, and Aleister Crowley. Damien said he did not remember when he wrote it, but they pointed out that it included his son's name, which he would not have been able to write before going into prison since his son was born while he was there.
As if you don't name your children before they're born.
I had no idea what he was going to be called. Damien had not been allowed to hold or even meet his son after he was born. So I think it's irrelevant that he, like, maybe wrote it. I don't know. Like, that his son's name was on the list because, like, he didn't even know his son. Like, they could have thought about that beforehand. Yeah. Damien explained that he had once had a paper to write on different alphabets, and he must have still been practicing writing in the alphabets when he was bored at prison. Mm-hmm. And he likely only wrote Crowley's name because it was in one of the books he had read when researching the different alphabets, and he must have remembered it. And they were like, so you just, like, remembered this name? And I was like, I think, though, that what's important is that he's writing in different alphabets that he, like, doesn't know.
He needs different letters.
I think he's saying he remembered how to write his name. Yeah. Because he had practiced it already.
Yeah.
The prosecution also called 2 teenage girls to testify that they had heard Damien confess to the murders at a softball game. The whole time they were testifying, Damien, if his eyes rolled any harder, they would have popped out his head. Mm-hmm. He was rolling his eyes, he was shaking his head, and then afterwards he said that the girls were just straight up lying. They brought up his interviews with police, which Damien pointed out were full of direct, loaded questions. They said, like, they were like, you said, quote, blah, blah, blah. So they were like, yeah, back up. They would tell him, you said blank. And Damien would say, no, they asked blank, and I agreed, or I responded to that direct question. Mm-hmm. So then they asked if he was implying that Officer Ridge was the one lying and Damien was telling the truth, and he said, I would not put it past him. You're asking the wrong fucking kid these sarcastic questions.
That's not, like, necessarily what I'm saying, but doesn't sound wrong.
I'm not saying he's a truther. During the defense's cross-examination of Dr. Griffiths, mm-hmm. he admitted that he took no classes to earn his PhD. It was essential. They were like, is this how you found out about the university? You saw here where it says call toll free? And he's like, yes, that's how I found out. So basically he had a mail order doctorate degree. Mm-hmm. When Damien took the stand, he explained that he had actually been a practicing Catholic for quite some time, which is why he changed his name to Damien, and he actually wanted to become a priest for a while, but he did not think he could commit to celibacy. Which is what an 18-year-old boy thing to say. Mm-hmm. What an 18-year-old teen dad thing to say. Mm-hmm. As he continued to study various religions, Damien found himself really resonating with the beliefs of the Wiccan community. In his testimony, he explained how they worshipped a goddess because, quote, people say we're all God's children, but men can't have children.
Also fair.
I love, like, his quotes were cracking me up. I was like, this is so serious, but, like, this kid, the driest kid ever. Mm-hmm. When asked about the Book of Shadows that Griffiths had spoken on, he explained that the pentagram was a positive symbol in his religion, but that it gave people the wrong idea of him because, quote, what people don't understand, they try to destroy and ridicule. Damien also testified that he had purchased the Book of Shadows at a 10-cent sale at the local library, and that those passages they had spoken about were already underlined when he got it. He believed someone may have been using the book as a resource for some sort of assignment because there were several portions underlined and there were notes in the margins, including a timeline.
there's like so much of like in the trial and then like in the way he answers police questions and stuff that like he's like, I'm just like doing basic critical thinking. Like I'm just like context clues, like just like using my brain here. And they're like, now how exactly would you know that? And he's like,
he's like, I literally, and then he said it's common sense. Like, so it's common sense hanging out. But he was like, he said, I found it at the library for 10 cents. He said there was a whole cart of books. And I'm assuming that it's books that either nobody checked out or that they didn't want on their shelves anymore. Probably because it was a book of shadows, is how he came to that conclusion. And they're like,
and because y'all are demonizing it right now.
Right. It's like, just guessing. And they asked him, they're like, well, you have books by Aleister Crowley. And he's like, I've never read them. And they were like, so you don't want to read him? He was like, no, I did. He's like, I didn't say I don't want to read him. I said I haven't. He's like, I will gladly read it. And they were like, see? FBI agent and personal hero to the podcast, John Douglas, worked up a profile of the murderer, which he turned in to Damien's legal team. He said that these murders were more indicative of a single murderer whose Sorry, I almost said it again. Whose motive was to degrade and punish the three boys, and it did not lend itself to the possibility of a group of unsophisticated teenage killers. Douglas's profile went on to say that the perpetrator was likely someone familiar with the victims and the area in which they were found. This killer would have had a personal reason to want these boys dead, and it didn't make sense that three teenagers who hadn't heard of them before their murders would have done it. He did not see any evidence that the murders were linked to satanic rituals, and he believed that the mutilation and stab wounds were actually injuries and marks caused by an animal. Frank J. Peretti, the coroner who had completed the boys' autopsies, testified kind of the opposite. He said that Chris Byers was not actually castrated, but that his penis had actually been skinned.
How are we finding his testicles under Damien's bed? Excuse me.
The defense asked Peretti if he, a doctor, would have been able to do this kind of skinning procedure under the conditions that police were saying the teens had done it in the dark, underwater, and in a matter of minutes. He said he did not believe he could have done any sort of medical operation in those conditions, let alone did he think a group of teenage boys could. So kind of like differing opinions there, I guess, that like either an animal did this or that whoever did this was incredibly skilled and that it happened elsewhere and then the boys were brought to the water.
But do you know what they agree on?
No, but I am going to tell you what another reason they think it might have been intentional. John Mark Byers, who was being treated for a brain tumor at the time of the trial, was called to testify about a knife he had given to a cameraman during the filming of the Paradise Lost documentary as a Christmas gift.
So nice.
It was a used knife, thank you. It was a Kershaw folding hunting knife, which Mark claimed he had never used. But when the cameraman made it back to New York and unpacked, he found that the knife had been used because it appeared to have blood on it. He was ordered by HBO to return the knife to the West Memphis PD, but it was not received until a month before trials began. The Damien's defense team actually speculates that this is why they had to postpone Jessie's trial, was because they were waiting for the results to get back, but they could not confirm. They were like, they're not going to tell us if it was, though. It's like, they're not going to tell you anything. When tests were originally run on the knife, the blood came back as a match for Mark's and Chris's HLA-DQ alpha genotype. During I'll explain what that means in a minute. During testimony, Mark said that he had actually used the knife once to trim his toenails and then cut deer meat around Thanksgiving.
That's the gift you gave someone.
Like, he's like, I used it once. And they're like, what do you use it for? He's like, trim toenails.
To trim them?
Trim toenails, cut venison. I was
you
like,
put
back
them
to
on
back?
a cutting board? Like, how are you trimming
How
them
long
with
are
a
your
knife?
toenails? A serrated knife.
Ooh.
He said that when he was using it, he must have cut his thumb and not realized it, which is why there was blood on the knife. Okay.
Except they had previously asked, did you ever cut yourself with this? Oh, no.
And now suddenly you remember exactly where you cut yourself and how. Damien's attorney, or one of Damien's attorneys, Val Price, asked Mark about the statement he gave to Gary Gitchell after the small amount of blood was tested, in which Mark said he had no idea how the blood had gotten on the knife. Mark responded that he actually assumed they had been asking him about Christopher's blood, which makes sense, I guess. And that he said that he had no idea because he would not have had any way of knowing if Chris had gotten a hold of the knife and played with it. So basically he's saying that they asked him, like, how did the blood get on the knife? And he assumed they meant Chris's blood. And he was like, I have no idea, because truthfully, if his stepson or son had grabbed his knife, there's no way he could have known that.
Because I don't pay any attention.
Yeah. And if he had grabbed the knife, it wasn't Mark's fault, because he kept it up and put away in his dresser and never used it because of its serrated edge.
Except those 2 times. Those 2 very different and strange times that I used it.
He said it was one time. That's
that one time I did it together. Just hoping he didn't go back and forth, venison back to toenails.
Yeah. He said that actually his memory returned later in the afternoon that he was speaking with Gary Gitchell, and he showed him the scar on his thumb from where he had cut himself with that knife, but that the recorder must have been off.
Gary Gitchell probably doesn't remember,
because he remembered it later. And he was like, I talk to Gary all the time, so like there's literally no telling when I told him that. He was actually more surprised to hear that it may have been his own blood, because he had no recollection of cutting himself until they were done talking about it on the recording. Perfect. Price brought up a portion of Mark's interview where an investigator told him that they had information that, quote, suggests strongly that you have something to do with the disappearance of the boys and ultimately the murders. Mark admitted that this question had upset him very much at the time, but the investigator quickly told him that he had to ask that question to get his reaction, and that calmed him down. He's like, oh, they're just doing their job. Michael DeGuglielmo, the director of the testing lab where the blood sample was sent, testified that he did not have enough blood to perform a full test, but he was able to do a sort of genotype testing, which showed that the blood on the knife contained a DNA factor called HLA-DQ alpha 1.14, which Mark and Christopher both had present in their blood. He went on to explain that although no one else in the Byers family had this genotype, it was purely coincidental that Mark and Chris did. It didn't like really necessarily mean anything that they both had it. And he said that 1 out of 11 people have at least one genetic marker of the same type, and they just happened to be stepfather and stepson.
Yeah.
On the stand, Mark denied having anything to do with the murders and showed the scar on his thumb that he attributed to cutting himself by mistake with the hunting knife. The scar that he didn't remember before. Damien's defense team felt that Mark had both the means and the motive to commit the crimes. This was funny to me. They said he works as a jeweler. He has precision.
Okay.
They also pointed out that some of the injuries on Chris's buttocks were, in fact, from a belt buckle, which Mark had whooped him with that afternoon. And Mark did testify to that on the stand. Another knife was also submitted into evidence. This was a serrated knife that had been found in the lake behind Jason's house in November of 1993. They kept saying, like, he hid it. He tucked it away in a lake. He tucked it away in a lake. And the reason I bring up both knives at the same time is because in the closing remarks, they take a grapefruit and they stab it with both knives, and they show that only the knife from Jason's lake makes the ... space pattern that was found on the boys, and the other one didn't. The other one was smaller, which could also probably be made by animal teeth, but and also, just because the knife was found in Jason's lake does not necessarily mean it is.
And is it like their lake? Like they like
the lake behind his house? I doubt it.
Yeah, I'm like, these boys, like,
yeah. Toward the end of the trial, Damien was able to hold his son for the first time. When asked about becoming a father, Damien talked about how it didn't feel real yet because he hadn't gotten to see his son. He also said that it made it difficult to conceive the idea of murdering anyone, but especially 3 little boys who didn't do anything to deserve it. But he said he felt good knowing that whoever had done this would have it come back to them somehow, even if it wasn't through a conviction. He said, like, I deeply believe that they will get what's coming to them, even if it's not going to prison.
Yeah.
Maybe like a brain tumor or something. I don't know. He joked that his son's first words would be capital murder.
Hilarious, Damien.
Well, they said, are his first words gonna be not guilty? He said, no, they're gonna be capital murder. I'm so comfortable right now. His lawyer talked to him about his responses to some of the questions he was asked on the stand and pointed out that his answers weren't favorable. And Damien admitted that he had started to daydream when testifying and was only half listening. His lawyer responded, well, then maybe they'll only half kill you in the electric chair. I was like, that's not only something I would say, to be honest.
Yeah, I will say, like, when you first said that, I was thinking that the judge said that, and I was like,
no.
But then I was like, wait, I guess that's kind of funny.
Yeah. He said, Damien was like, okay.
Haha, I'm really kind of terrified, but
Jason's lawyer told him it was probably a good idea that he hadn't testified because it really seemed to hurt Damien in court, and Jason was only guilty
Jason
by association.
Been more likable.
Yeah. Damien had said that he and Jason were always more like brothers than friends, but now Jason's lawyer was telling him that he needed to be more careful about picking his friends in the future. He asked if Jason would stop being friends with Damien now, and Jason said he wouldn't be his enemy, but that it would be hard to be friends after this. And I want us to watch this conversation because I was truly, like, so shocked that this lawyer was, like, saying these things. And the whole time, all I could think was, like, Jason is such a little boy. Like, he's so uncomfortable. He, like, doesn't want to talk bad about his friend. Don't really seem to understand what's going on. So we're gonna watch this.
What's it feel like to go through a month-long trial accused of something you didn't do?
Horrible.
Are you nervous now?
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing we can do right now but sit around and wait, but you got anything you want to ask me?
Where do we go when the jury comes back out and says I'm not guilty?
Well, where do you want to go? Where do you want to go?
Disneyland, maybe?
Would you? Would you like to go to Disneyland? Have you ever been anywhere have you ever been on a trip at all?
Heber Springs.
Heber Springs. Well, I tell you what, my man, it'd be a joy to take you. you like to go? You would, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Do you understand now why we didn't want you to testify?
Yeah.
Can you see how it hurt Damien? I think it did. And you see how they talked about his witnesses?
Mm-hmm.
See, they didn't have anything to talk about us. They didn't have anything to talk about because we didn't give them a chance. And, oh, man. It's heavy. Do you think that this will change at all? How you choose your friends?
Yeah.
What do you think this would do? What do you think this is going to do to you and Damien? You and your friendship with Damien?
Stop it, I guess. Yes.
Would you stop being his friend?
I wouldn't be his enemy, but after this, I probably wouldn't be around or that.
You heard what was said about him. You think you could have done it?
About what they said?
Yeah, you think he could have? Do you think Damien could have killed those little boys?
They made it seem like he did.
What do you think?
I don't know.
If you're on that jury, would you have a hard time letting him go? Based on what you heard?
Yeah.
I would too.
I just think he's so icky.
I
just think he's so icky.
Who? The lawyer?
The lawyer.
Oh, I was like, do you not say that about Jason?
No, like he's like, if you were on the jury, like, what the fuck up?
Yeah, and it like, yeah, I think it like sucks to try to like do that to these boys.
Yeah.
And like I don't remember the details, but like I kind of feel like there was information about like Jason like being with Damien like at least earlier in that day. So I feel like logically like he knows like
right.
I saw him before, I saw him right after. Like I don't think this, I mean, but like I guess it could, like, but it just feels like not fair.
Yeah.
To basically say like, well, if it wasn't you, it had to be him. So like, don't you think it might have been him? And it's like, if it wasn't me who they're saying did it with him, then like, why would it be him? Like,
it feels like pitting them against each other, which seems silly because they're supposed to be on the same like team, but also like it feels like this lawyer thinks Damien did it, and he's like trying to get Jason to believe that, and then right after that clip from the film, it pans to Damien, and his lawyers are like asking him what he thought about like how the trial had gone, and he was like, he's like, I think we're gonna be fine. Like I think we said everything we need to say. He's like, I really didn't like Jason's lawyer in his closing remarks saying that Jason was guilty by association because like what did I do?
Yeah, and I think like I understand that like. In maybe in their mind, like you would never make the argument that Jason did it alone, right? Like that's not even an option,
right?
But like they can at least try to distance Jason from it when a whole city of people is already convinced that Damien did it, and say like, no, this man is such a monster, he could have done it by himself,
right?
I don't know that I think the lawyer actually thought Damien did it, maybe, but like I feel like he just kind of was like, this is our best way out, and like these people are so convinced that it's him that like we better just like get on board. But yeah,
it just feels like slimy to do it after closing remarks in private. I also did not like how much he was touching his leg.
Yes, I was gonna say that. But like you don't need to do it to Jason, who at the very least just lost his best friend.
Right.
And when he said like, I think it'd be hard for us to stay friends, like he said something like, because he won't be here. Like he's thinking like Damien's going to prison no matter what. Like I might get off, but like how would we be friends? He's in prison. So like they've already like convinced him like
he won't be
around.
Yeah. On March 19th, 1994, Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin were found guilty on 3 counts of capital murder. Jason was sentenced to life in prison, and Damien, the only legal adult of the 3, was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Gary Gitchell told the press the day of the convictions that this was hopefully his last case. Agreed. Please don't do this again. After their convictions and the widespread notoriety the case had received, several people across the country began to express their opinion on the case. It became pretty commonly believed that the trial was riddled with emotional bias and that the West Memphis Three, as they were coined, were wrongfully convicted. Documentaries were created and fundraisers were spearheaded by celebrities to free the 3. Eventually, even some of the parents of the 3 victims became vocal about doubting that the West Memphis 3 were guilty. Rick Murray, who is Stevie's biological father, we didn't talk about him a lot, Pam Hobbs, and even John Mark Byers spoke out about the possibility that the teens were wrongfully convicted. John Mark Byers said, quote, "I had made the comment that if it were proven that the 3 were innocent, I'd be the first to lead the charge for their freedom. I'll take every opportunity that I have to voice that the West Memphis 3 are innocent, and the evidence and proof prove they're innocent." End quote.
Okay.
Good for you, I guess. In May of 1994, all 3 young men appealed their convictions, but all of the convictions were upheld on direct appeal by the Arkansas Supreme Court. In June of 1996, Dan Stidham, Jessie's lawyer, was preparing for another appeal. This time, they were going to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then I didn't put how that went, I guess.
Not well.
He was still in prison.
Yeah.
Damien Eccles attempted to appeal his conviction at the age of 27, claiming that he had been incompetent to stand trial due to his history of mental illness. Which again, I don't know. He cited his 1992 stay at a mental health facility as evidence that he was not fit to stand trial.
Yeah, it's interesting. Is he just kind of trying to say, well, if y'all fucking think this, then you shouldn't have,
It's so crazy. He had not waived his assertion that he was mentally competent to stand trial because, according to the appellate legal team, he was not competent to waive it. They alleged that Damien's mental health continued to worsen during the trial, where he, quote, developed a psychotic euphoria that caused him to believe he would evolve into a superior entity and eventually be transported to a different world, end quote.
Interesting.
Okay. For sure, interesting. But again, I also wonder, are these hallucinations, or is this because he's so interested in learning about other religions, are these things that he's read about that he's I could do that too? I don't know.
I don't know about that one.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about I don't know. The appellate legal team retained a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. George Woods from Berkeley, to serve as an expert. He claimed that Damien's psychosis had dominated his perceptions of the trial and his time in prison while awaiting the trial. Again, don't have a conclusion for that. What am I doing?
Yeah, I know we keep saying how confused we are about whether or not Damien was psychotic, but I want to believe him. So in his book, he said that post-conviction, you're offered a mitigator for something. I don't really understand. But that this person wrote a report saying that he was schizophrenic, bipolar, suicidal, and had extreme hallucinations. And kind of like you just said, people considered this some of the most damning information, which first of all is not really how murder trials go. That the reason we're convinced that they're murderers is because they're schizophrenic, but okay. But this person couldn't even testify to their report because she had already been proven to have lied in another case on this stand. But then Damien basically is saying in his book, I've never, he doesn't actually say it, but to me, by insinuating that she's a liar, what he is trying to say is that is not true, and those are not things he experiences. But maybe, like, that was a wrong assumption on my part. Maybe he was just trying to say that, like, they were somewhat untrue, or they were, like, not completely accurate. Like, I just don't really know.
And I think we said, like, that maybe the, like, self-mutilation, the depression, like, suicidal, like, those things are true.
He probably had, like, really severe anxiety. He probably did have, like, some, like, intense paranoia.
Right.
Or, like, PTSD, or I don't know.
Yeah. I already said this, but in Paradise Lost, he says that he, like, never understood why he was put in the hospital.
Because they didn't tell him.
Yeah, and he never felt like he belonged there, because he, at least at the time, he was like, why am I here? Like, what am I suffering from? And he, which again, this lends itself to the paranoia. He believed that the police had put him there because in 1992 they didn't have a reason to arrest him yet.
Yeah, and it's also, like, any sort of, like, psychosis symptoms that could have come, like, after his arrest. Like, people really do experience, like, sleep deprivation hallucinations, and, like, those types of things, like, can happen, like, short term.
Right.
Just based on, like, circumstances. So it's like, did he maybe start having these symptoms, like, when he says, like, I was incompetent to stand trial, was he starting to, like, experience these things because he wasn't sleeping in prison, or because, like, I just don't know.
And they said it was
It's, like,
worsening. Yeah. In 1996, Damien, Jason, and Jessie all submitted imprints of their teeth to be compared to the bite marks on Stevie Branch's forehead that had recently come up. I mentioned these bite marks in episode 1 because it's, like, a proven thing now, but it is important to clarify, I feel, that they were not mentioned in the original autopsy or the trials. So they were brought up in 1996. None of their teeth were matches for the imprint left on Stevie's head. And I'm assuming you're going to get to the other teeth thing.
Kind of.
Okay.
Briefly.
In 2003, Vicki Hutchison gave an interview to the Arkansas Times in which she stated that she had fabricated everything she and her son Aaron had told police to implicate Damien, Jason, and Jessie. She explained that police had told her if she did not cooperate and give them information that they wanted, they would take Aaron away from her. She knew they wanted the 3 teens to go down for the murders because they were using photos of them as dartboards on the walls of the police station.
Awesome.
Vicki says that they were asked to sign an affidavit of silence and told not to speak about this at all.
This is just, like, good for you, I guess, for admitting that, but, like, how fucking embarrassing. And then you go,
I know.
I don't know if that's actually a real thing.
Yeah. She said, quote, I learned there's no such thing as an affidavit of silence, but that's how it was described to us. Aaron also acknowledges that Jessie could not have been involved because he knew Jessie well and would have immediately recognized him, end quote.
Yes. And the police should have also known that.
Right.
We made this kid implicate his babysitter, but
right.
No worries.
She actually recalled a time that the 3 teens had appeared on the news, and she remembers Aaron falling to his knees yelling, no, Jessie didn't do this. Which, like, at that point, how do you as a mother not, like, be like, we have to stop this charade? Both of them alleged that when Aaron was shown a photo lineup, Damien Eccles' photo was significantly larger than anyone else's.
I wonder if she, like, to comfort him, was like, well, when you go talk to the police, like, you can tell them Jessie didn't actually kill anyone.
Yeah.
Because then in his interview, he's like, no, Jessie didn't kill nobody. And it's like, man.
Years after the trials, a case of misconduct on the part of Kent Arnold, the jury foreman on Damien and Jason's trial, came up. Evidently, he was very invested in the case before the trial and was already convinced of the teens' guilt. During jury selection for Damien and Jason's trial, he purposely left out these beliefs because he wanted to get on the jury and influence the case. He had discussed the case with another attorney before deliberations had begun and told him that he was worried the state wasn't doing enough and that they wouldn't reach a guilty verdict.
He would ask on them.
Right. That's their job.
Yeah.
He would ask his legal opinion on how he could convince a jury of their guilt. He had seen Jessie's trial and had gained knowledge of inadmissible evidence from Jessie Misskelley's trial. Arnold was accused of advocating for the guilt of the West Memphis Three by giving this inadmissible evidence to the rest of the jury. This was later proven when handwritten notes were found from jury deliberation with one line marked out in black Sharpie. One juror, though, still had the original, which read, quote, Jessie Miss Kelly Jr. testimony led to the arrests, end quote.
That's wild.
This led to a post-conviction relief hearing. Jessie's attorney, Daniel Stidham, confirmed under oath that during the trial, Judge David Burnett did have improper communication with the jury during its deliberations. He testified that he had overheard Judge Burnett speaking with T.J. Williams, the foreperson on Jessie's jury. During this conversation, Williams told Judge Barnett that the jury was almost finished with their decision. Judge Barnett then said that the jury would need food for when they came back from sentencing. After this, Williams asked what would happen if Jessie Miss Kelly was acquitted. At this, the judge closed the door and Stidham was unable to hear his response. But I think the fact that he's saying sentencing is already an implication enough of what he thinks is going to happen.
Right.
Stidham testified that he was a part of the problem in the situation by not reporting this incident on the court record, which is the minimum requirement of the state law in representation. Stidham testified that this qualified as ineffective assistance of counsel, and he suggested that Jessie's conviction be vacated as a result.
He said, my bad.
I'm ineffective.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's on me, friends.
In 2007, new forensic evidence was submitted in another effort to free the three. Most of the DNA that was taken from the scene belonged to the victims, but there was one additional profile that, when tested, did not match any of the 8-year-old boys or the teenagers who had been arrested for their murders. There was also a hair found in the knots used to bind one of the victims. This hair came back as not matching any of the convicted teens. However, according to a declaration in the United States District Court, Eastern District of Arkansas, Western Division, it was believed that at least one hair found at the scene, or it was claimed that at least one hair found at the scene was consistent with the hair type of David Jacoby, Terry Hobbs' friend, and alibi for the day of the murders. This evidence wasn't able to be submitted pre-conviction because DNA testing wasn't technologically advanced enough. In 2007, though, things were different, and that DNA was getting a second chance. Because of this, Damien Eccles' defense lawyers petitioned for a retrial for a writ of habeas corpus. They cited that this DNA evidence linked Terry Hobbs to the crime scene. They also cited new expert testimony that indicated that the cuts in Chris's genital mutilation was in fact the result of animals disturbing the bodies post-mortem. A hearing was held in the Federal District Court for the Eastern District of Arkansas, but the petition failed when Judge David Burnett, the original trial judge on both cases, disallowed presentation of the new DNA information in court. He claimed that the DNA tests were inconclusive. However, this ruling was thrown out by the Arkansas Supreme Court on November 4th, 2010. And that is where I'm going to let Katie take over for next week.
Woo! Yeah, next week we get to do the good news of this case and additional theories. If it wasn't clear, we don't like this one.
Yeah, I have trouble calling it good news.
Well, I didn't know if I wanted to just say release, but I guess everyone knows that. Well, yes. The silver lining.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.